The US is talking to the Taliban. That's according to the Afghan president in the first public confirmation of such talks. But still, few details are known. So, who is doing the talking? What are the terms? And can it lead to peace for Afghanistan? This is Inside Story. Hello there, a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Afghanistan's President Hamid Karzai announced on Saturday that the US has begun peace talks with the Taliban.
Peace negotiations with the Taliban and with other countrymen have started. Those who accept the constitution, freedom, democracy and development of Afghanistan can take part in this negotiation. The foreign military and especially the United States itself are going ahead with these negotiations.
Well, the US has remained silent on this issue, but there has been a shift in Washington's position towards the Taliban, suggesting it is ready to negotiate with the group it is always aligned with al-Qaeda. Roger Wilkinson has this report.
Karzai's speech came a day after the UN Security Council voted to treat al-Qaeda and the Taliban separately regarding sanctions. Envoys at the world body said that could help induce the Taliban into peace talks. The State Department would neither confirm nor deny Karzai's assertion that the U.S. is talking to the Taliban.
So it wouldn't surprise me if there are contacts. I don't think there's a basis for negotiations.
U.S. officials have reportedly met former Taliban functionaries but have been unable to reach anybody who has the confidence of Taliban leader Mullah Omar. The international coalition appears to be far more willing to negotiate than the Taliban, who have publicly rejected talks, as long as there are foreign troops in Afghanistan. Taliban leadership see the Karzai government as a puppet regime backed by an occupying army and have rebuffed its overtures for years. The West has insisted that the Taliban renounce violence, break with al-Qaeda, and abide by the Afghan constitution before reconciliation can take place. But a few months ago, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton articulated the U.S.'s position on how to achieve a peaceful settlement to the war. She compared it to negotiating with the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Now, I know that reconciling with an adversary that can be as brutal as the Taliban sounds distasteful, even unimaginable. And diplomacy would be a lot easier if we only had to talk to our friends. But that is not how one makes peace.
Hanging over this scenario is the planned withdrawal in 2014 of U.S. and NATO forces. The first contingent is expected to come out next month. Some current and former U.S. officials believe the Taliban may only be playing for time.
If the U.S. or NATO is talking about getting out in a few years, can they divide a wedge, produce a wedge between the Afghan government and the international forces? Can they expedite that withdrawal? Can they position themselves so that they can achieve their objectives at the right time?
The Afghan war, the longest in U.S. history, is unpopular at home amid growing economic woes and a mounting U.S. death toll. And even though some argue that the U.S. should stick it out, the Obama administration is wary of becoming trapped in a quagmire and may see talking to the Taliban as a way of speeding up its eventual departure. Roger Wilkinson, Al Jazeera.
So certainly a lot of questions to be asked, and here to try to help to answer them, our guests Hasib Humayun, a risk assessment consultant in Kabul, and Thomas Ruttig, co-director of political think tank Afghanistan Analysts Network, also in Kabul. Welcome, both of you gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. Now, Hasib Humayun, if I can start with you. Why do you think Karzai has announced these talks now?
Thank you for having me here. I think there are many factors playing into this. We have had media reports of the U.S. pursuing contact with elements of the insurgency, and perhaps even there have been names mentioned in some media stories of people who have been contacted who do claim to have some credence with the Taliban leader Mullah Omar. It remains to be seen again if those stories are factual and if the contacts do actually carry any weight within the insurgency. But all of that have led to the recent announcement in public by President Karzai. Now, whether that is part of a deliberate strategy by the government to come out at this time and announce all these contacts that may have been going on for a while, to make it public, that remains to be seen. Or maybe or is it just another statement amongst many that the president tends to make recently in his public statements? That again is that's another factor that could be playing into it. So it is a bit too early to say whether it's part of a deliberate strategy on the part of the Afghan government to come out and make this public, the contact that may have been established between the U.S. and elements of the insurgency, the Taliban, specifically the Quetta Shura, as media stories say.
Certainly, Karzai has been very antagonistic towards the U.S. and other allied forces in Afghanistan. Do you get the impression that he may have been sidelined in these talks?
That's a risk. That's a risk because, as we have seen over time, since at least for the past 3 to 4 years, he's been very forthcoming and has rather open embraces for the insurgency. At times, that has led to antagonism and unease amongst the people back home in Afghanistan itself, and at times it has come across as rather one-sided. And all of a sudden, so he has spent a lot of political capital, a great deal of it, both in and maybe even monetary capital and contacts, all of them he has spent towards trying to have an Afghan lead on this process, that he be the focal point for any contact with the insurgents or any eventual negotiations if it comes to that any time in the future, near or far. And all of a sudden, there have been media stories of the U.S. pursuing tracks that probably do not involve Afghan interlocutors at this stage. That in itself could cause unease amongst the president's staff, or he himself in particular, questions of sidelining, questions of the government's position, or whether the government is represented in any eventual negotiation between the Taliban and the United States. If it is happening, again, that's a question mark on it. All of that, those questions may be raised right now, and the media stories that it could be tracked to that, and could be tracked to the fact that contact at some level probably is established now, especially after the public announcement by Secretary Clinton back in early this year that one way to approach the conflict here in Afghanistan is to open channels of talks with the insurgents.
Yeah.
So
let me just bring in Thomas Rutger at this point, because we haven't actually had any response from the US towards this. What do you think is going on? What's your take on this?
First, I would be really careful about taking everything at face value, what is said about that issue. There is talk about talks since much more than a year. And also the terminology President Karzai has been using, peace and negotiations, I think that's a little bit premature. If anything's going on, these are exploratory talks with people close to the Taliban in order to get access to the leadership of Mullah Omar. If that's going on, that's all moves into the right direction, but we are not at all in a stage, in a moment where it has become substantial. So there's still a long way to peace talks or peace negotiations. These are preliminary talks.
Who do you think is doing the talking at the moment? How close do you think these representatives or members may or may not be to the leadership of the Taliban?
That's all guesswork, because we know nothing for sure who's talking with whom. There have been some names out, if that is true. There were some people mentioned which are close to Mullah Omar. Then that would be a good door towards the Quetta Shura or the Taliban leadership. But again, that does not mean that we are in substantial talks. Also, the Taliban would probably interested in gauging and finding out what the chances for a political settlement are.
We've heard the outgoing Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, say that they would be looking at political talks by the year end. And if that is the case, then there really would be the conditions right now for these preliminary talks, wouldn't there?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's absolutely timely, if not too late, to try to open these channels with the perspective of 2014 and the drawdown of US and other Western troops in Afghanistan. A lot of time has already been lost, but I would be careful to be too optimistic whether we see something at the end of the year or not. important is that progress is made, because the last thing what the Afghans need is a continuation of the bloodshed which is going on in the moment.
Hasib Humayun, I'm wondering to what extent the Afghan government is likely to be involved here, and how willing the Taliban is to talk to Karzai's government.
Facts again, for the past couple of years, the Afghan government has been pretty willing to talk to them. There has been a moderated approach to the insurgents. Each time they attack or each time they blow things up, the response rather has been calm, and that again is in itself some sort of an inducement, if you will, to try to get them into talking, to try to get them to to change their approaches. But it hasn't yielded anything that's substantial, and it's been a process that's been going on for many, or at least 2 to 3 years. Now, that could be grounds to at least assume that the Taliban don't seem to be that willing to talk to the Afghan government. There's another question that's missing, another element to this, and that's, are the Taliban even an autonomous actor? That question needs to be raised. In the past, we've seen that certain channels of communications that were opened with them, in particular, there was discussion of the number 2 amongst the Taliban, especially the Quetta Shura, Mullah Baradar, pursuing a channel of political discussions with elements of the Kabul government, President Karzai's team perhaps, or at least there was a line open between the two sides. That's been pretty much established now. It went far, only for Pakistan to then intervene and then take out Baradar, put him in jail. So that whole track went dry. Now that's in itself evidence for the fact that the Taliban, even if they try to pursue a track with the Afghan government, that's detached from what's their support base in Pakistan, amongst be it in the military or elements connected to the military, all of it, they would be very hard pressed to be any autonomous. Now that's a question that needs to be answered even in the current ongoing discussions. And another side of it, if the US is pursuing this track, and assuming that
let me just pick up on that one point that you
yes.
mentioned, because it is important. So I'd like to bring Thomas Ruttig in with his ideas, because on Saturday we saw a very brazen attack by the Taliban in downtown Kabul, even as the president announced that the US was in discussions. So how divided is this movement, and are there elements that will never negotiate?
Yes, of course, the Taliban are not so unified that we see them all now marching towards talks and negotiations. As bad as that incident in Kabul was, we also should not exaggerate its importance, because it was definitely prepared early on, so that was not a direct answer to Karzai's speech on the US talks with the Taliban. But definitely there are factions in the Taliban, and probably those who Hasib was referring to, those who are very closely linked to Pakistan, who are not interested in any talks between the Taliban, the US, the Afghan government, without Pakistan playing a strong role in that.
Let's talk a little bit more about the involvement of other groups in the Taliban and the current conditions for possible talks. As we saw in our report earlier on Friday, the United Nations Security Council separated a sanctions list for al-Qaeda from the Taliban. Now, as host to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan after the attacks of September the 11th, the Taliban was seen as part of the same organisation, but it has since said that it will not let Afghanistan be used to harm other countries. Now, 138 members of the Taliban will now be put on their own UN blacklist. The Afghan government wants the names of around 20 former members to be removed. Thomas Ruttig, what impact do you think that this UN decision to formally separate the Taliban from al-Qaeda will have?
First, it makes a lot of sense, because it is clear since a long time that al-Qaeda and the Taliban are not the same organization. Al-Qaeda is an organization which operates worldwide, has a jihadist agenda, while the Taliban have shown no sign that they're interested in much what is happening outside Afghanistan. So that's the first step into the direction to take the Taliban as that what they are, movement which is linked to Afghanistan. On the other hand, I'm not sure whether they will be very much impressed by that. They have been asking for de-blacklisting, so to say, as one of their preconditions unofficially for entering into talks, and we will see how it will go forward. In the moment, it seems that these are former Taliban who are already living in Afghanistan who will be taken off the list.
Hasib Humayun, were they right to separate these two groups, or are there still elements of al-Qaeda operating and helping with the Taliban?
It's a very hard question to answer because, again, I don't think it's as clear as Thomas made it look, because we've seen a history of close cooperation between the two parties, the Taliban and al-Qaeda, even if they're not blended together. They use similar tactics, they host each other. In fact, if you go back to 2001, one of the reasons why they got treated the same was because of Mullah Omar and company's unwillingness to let Osama bin Laden be handed over. Now that shows a level of cohesion or a level of proximity that we shouldn't discard here. The same applies to some elements. Right now, obviously, over time, the discussion is that the Quetta Shura, the Mullah Omar side of the Taliban, that has largely turned into a list connected to al-Qaeda. At least that's the claim being made. Whereas we increasingly know that the Haqqani side of the equation, the ones based in Miram Shah and Waziristan and elsewhere around in Pakistan, they have close ties to militant networks, al-Qaeda and other militant networks, regional as well as international. Now all of that is room for caution. That's grounds for caution. But we do understand that this whole effort has been made as yet another inducement, as yet another effort to try to draw them into some sort of a political equation, to draw them away from violence.
Okay,
it remains to be seen.
I mean, the Taliban
Yes.
have always been very dismissive of any idea of talks, at least publicly. So will this work?
One has to remain very skeptical about this, because over time what we have seen is, again, their tactics have gone rather brutal. They keep harming civilians, and they, as indicated yesterday, in Kabul, in a place where it was a market full of people who are rather lower to middle-class Kabulis, and there is a police station, but had those 4 people blown themselves out, there would have been massive civilian casualties, and I'm sure they knew that. So these tactics, all of them indicate that they may be very reluctant to draw away from their instrument, which is violence and then projection of fear. So it's too early to say if any other inducement is going to change their behavior.
Okay, well, let's look a little bit more about at Pakistan. Thomas Ruttig, there's a lot of talk of the Taliban becoming increasingly active in eastern Afghanistan, of course, on that northwest border with Pakistan. A lot of talk of the Haqqani network, even of Taliban leaders being protected within Pakistan. To what extent is it critical that Pakistan is involved in any talks with the Taliban?
That's very difficult to say. Well, I mean, no, it's easy to say because the Taliban are living there, and we have strong indications that they are minded by people who are very close to the administration in Pakistan, but that's something different from talks. Of course, Pakistan has made a 180-degree turn a year ago or so, saying, after denying for years that they had any knowledge and any links with the Taliban, saying they would be able to deliver them for talks. But I have not seen that yet. I have the feeling that there's still a very strong Pakistani interest to keep control over the Taliban and also over talks, which has to do with the relationship between Pakistan and India. I think as long as there's no at least an improvement of the atmosphere between both countries, Pakistan will probably continue its course, which is following in the moment vis-à-vis Afghanistan, which is using the Taliban as one instrument, as one card in that
Okay, so the
game.
US says it wants stability in Pakistan alongside Afghanistan. So to what extent does Pakistan need to be involved in these talks for that to happen?
Yes, Pakistan needs to help in those talks because I think the Pakistani leadership, the Pakistani military needs to understand that the Taliban are a danger for them, but for the time being they're differentiating between the Pakistani Taliban who fight against the regime and the government in Islamabad. These are the bad Taliban, and the good Taliban are the Afghan Taliban who are only busy with Afghanistan. I think that differentiation needs to end, and violent global jihadist movements need to be seen as what they are, a danger for stability both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and you cannot have stability in Afghanistan without stability in Pakistan and vice versa.
Okay, so Hasib Humayun, how How confident are you that the Afghan government will get involved in peace talks with the Taliban, with the US, that everyone will be brought to the table?
That's a very hard question to ask at this stage, because the Afghan government, again, has tried over time to lead this process, but the track has been rather too slow, or at times there have been problems with that. Sometimes you've, and it's the process as a whole doesn't even, if the U.S. remains the elephant in the room in the Afghanistan equation right now, but you've got other actors involved. There are stories of Germany pursuing or facilitating some of the contacts with the Taliban. We had that earlier last year, the story of a shopkeeper coming in pretending to be speaking for the Taliban movement. So all of these things, the equation is very chaotic. It's confusing as well. For the Afghan government to become a player, it has to at least find a better way of negotiating all the internal interests that exist in Afghanistan. At this stage, one has to be very fair with saying that the Afghan government has gone very fast in trying to declare openness towards negotiations and talking with the Taliban, when other parties are asking questions on the Afghan side of the equation. They're asking questions about what is on the table in terms of up for negotiations, what are the terms under which these negotiations need to happen. There's unease about what will the Taliban keep, both from their ideology as well as from their arsenal. So all these questions remain to be answered internally. There's an internal negotiation that we on our own need to do to come across as both a cohesive force with whom both, again, this is we're exaggerating the Taliban negotiation part of this. The negotiation, if it has to happen and if it is to yield any real results, needs to happen at some level with Pakistan. Now at that level, we again have to have clarity on what is it that Pakistan expects from Afghanistan, what can Afghanistan yield, what are the red lines that Afghanistan has. All these questions remain unanswered, but again I want to shift the focus back to the whole question that eventually it has to be some level of a negotiation, some level of accommodation of Pakistan, of how Pakistan sees things.
Okay, well, as we approach to the end of this program, I want to look a little bit closer at the end goals to any negotiations that may be taking place. And Thomas Ruttig, has been suggested that the end goals of the US and the Taliban differ quite drastically, with the West hoping that the Taliban will be brought into a broader political settlement, but the Taliban itself seeing a much larger role for itself. Do you think there can be some merging of aims?
Yes, of course, that will need some time. But I also want to point to something else, which is that we very often concentrate too much on Pakistan, the Taliban, the Afghan government. Afghanistan is a little bit broader. And what we're seeing in the moment is that there's strong opposition against talks by some elements of the former Northern Alliance. They're not using that name anymore, but they come from there. Also in civil society, which are extremely concerned about that deal might be reached too quickly without sticking to the principles and throwing a lot of that overboard, namely freedoms and rights which have been achieved under the new Afghan constitution, which once had been red lines and which now had been made the target, the aim of what should be reached in negotiations when we listen to Mrs. Clinton's speech in February in the Asia Society in New York.
Hasiba, just give you a chance to respond to that. Do you think now is the right time to be talking?
There's a general recognition, again, amongst many parties in Afghanistan, be it the civil society, be it the youth, be it people from, again, what Thomas called the Northern Alliance and newly emerging leaders. There is a recognition that political tracks need to be explored and that violence needs some sort of a solution that has to be political, but that doesn't mean we're ready to talk at this stage. Because at this stage, again, we do have a lot of internal questions that need to be answered, which the risk is that rushing too fast into an equation with the Taliban or into some sort of a discussion where some major parties on the other side are left out, and some major concerns unrepresented around that table, that's going to breed further problems. It may yield a quick result, 6 month last or a year last or whatever time frame you can put it, deal. But again, we have to understand many concerns remain. Many concerns remain about who is talking, about what are the issues being talked about, and what is on the table in terms of the achievements that have been made over the past 10 years, both in terms of civil and political rights in this country, in terms of the progress of women and of youth and of institutions that have, such as media in particular. So all these questions, before that, there needs to be a clarity on the Afghan side. And with that package, then if the Taliban are willing to talk, which they haven't expressed at this stage, again, because each time there is opening towards talking with them, the response has often been very much a projection of fear and violence in the public space.
OK, all right, we will have to leave it there. Certainly critical weeks and months ahead, especially as the US starts to withdraw troops. And of course, that will have to wait for another day's discussion. Many thanks to our guests today, Hasib Humayun and Thomas Ruttig. And thanks to you too for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. If you want to get involved, do email your comments and suggestions to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.